My son changed the locks on my own front door while I was at church. I came home on a Sunday afternoon with a casserole dish in my hands and found my key didn't work anymore. My belongings were in trash bags on the porch. And taped to the door, in his handwriting, was a note that said, "Mom, this is for the best. You'll thank me later. Tyler." I was 58 years old. I had owned that house for 26 years. And my own son had just stolen it out from under me legally, on paper, with my signature on documents I barely remember signing. 6 months later, that same son was sitting across from me, crying, asking me to forgive him. This is what happened in between. My name is Deborah Ashford. I am 59 years old now. I live in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in a house I bought back. Yes, bought back. You'll understand what that means soon. That sits on a quiet street with mature oak trees and neighbors who have known me for over 2 decades. This house has been the center of my life since 1998, when my late husband, Carl, and I purchased it with everything we had saved during the first 8 years of our marriage. Carl died in 2015 of pancreatic cancer. We had 11 months from diagnosis to the end, and I spent every one of those months by his side, in this house, in the bedroom where he eventually passed surrounded by family. After he died, I stayed. I could have sold. People told me to sell. Too much house for one woman, too many memories, too much upkeep. But I stayed because the house held Carl in every corner, and I wasn't ready to let go of that. I have 2 children. My daughter, Michelle, lives in Tulsa as well, about 15 minutes from me, married with 2 children of her own, working as a pediatric nurse. My son, Tyler, is 34 years old, and for most of his adult life he has struggled with employment, with relationships, with what I now understand, looking back with the clarity that distance provides, was a pattern of behavior that I spent years making excuses for. I want to be honest about my role in what happened, because I think it matters. Tyler was always my more difficult child. Where Michelle was steady and self-directed from a young age, Tyler needed more attention, more reassurance, more rescuing from consequences he had created for himself. After Carl died, that need intensified. Tyler told me more than once in those grieving years that I was all he had left. I believed that meant something different than what it actually meant. What it meant was that Tyler had identified, consciously or not, that my grief and my love for him had created an opening. In 2019, Tyler moved back into my house. He had lost his apartment after losing his job at a logistics company, and he asked if he could stay with me, just for a few months, while he got back on his feet. I said yes immediately. Of course I said yes. He was my son. The few months became a year. The year became 3 years. Tyler did not pay rent, though he occasionally contributed to groceries. He did not consistently hold employment, a series of jobs that started with enthusiasm and ended, within months, with some explanation involving an unfair boss or a toxic workplace or circumstances beyond his control. I want to be clear that I am not condemning my son's struggles as character flaws without nuance, mental health, the difficulty of the job market, genuine bad luck. These things exist, and I do not dismiss them. But I also know now that I spent 3 years not asking hard questions because I was afraid of what the answers would cost me. In early 2023, Tyler approached me with what he described as a way to help with the bills and make things easier for both of us. He explained that if I added him to the deed of the house, just as a co-owner, nothing that would change anything about my life, it would simplify things in case anything happened to me, avoid probate complications, and allow him to help manage some of the household expenses more directly through shared financial responsibility. I want you to understand the state I was in when this conversation happened. I was 57 years old. I had spent 8 years grieving a husband I still talked to sometimes, out loud, in an empty kitchen. I had spent 3 years watching my son struggle and feeling, somewhere beneath my conscious awareness, that helping him was the last meaningful thing I could do to honor what Carl and I had built together as parents. I was tired in a way that goes beyond sleep. And Tyler, my son, was telling me this would make things easier. I went with him to a title company. I signed paperwork I did not fully read, trusting my son's explanation of what it meant, in a process that took less than 30 minutes and that I now understand was specifically structured to be brief, friendly, and uncomplicated by careful questions. What I had signed was a quitclaim deed that transferred full ownership of the house to Tyler, with me retaining a life estate, meaning, on paper, that I had the right to live in the house until my death, but Tyler held outright ownership. Tyler had explained none of this clearly. What I understood was that we were now co-owners. What had actually happened was that I had given my son the house, retaining only a conditional right to occupy it. For about a year, nothing changed. I continued living in my home, paying the utilities, maintaining the property as I always had. Tyler continued living there too, his employment situation no more stable than before. I did not think about the deed again. I had, in some sense, already half forgotten what I had signed. Then, in October of last year, Tyler began dating a woman named Crystal. I will not spend much time on Crystal in this story, except to say that within 2 months of the relationship beginning, Tyler's tone toward me began to shift in ways I did not immediately understand. He became impatient with me in small ways, critical of things that had never bothered him before: how I kept the kitchen, what I watched on television in the evenings, the schedule I kept for visiting Carl's grave on Sundays before church. Crystal began spending significant time at the house. I tried, repeatedly, to be welcoming. I made dinners. I asked about her work. I told myself this was simply the adjustment period of a new relationship finding its footing in a shared space. In December, Tyler told me that Crystal was moving in permanently, and that the three of us needed to figure out a better living arrangement. I did not understand, even then, what that meant. I found out on a Sunday afternoon in February. I had gone to church, as I do every week, and afterward I had stopped by the grocery store to pick up ingredients for a casserole I was bringing to a neighbor recovering from surgery. I drove home with the casserole dish balanced on the passenger seat, thinking about nothing more complicated than whether I had remembered to buy enough cheese. My key did not work in the front door. I stood on my own porch for several minutes, trying the key again and again, genuinely confused, before I noticed the trash bags. 6 of them lined up neatly against the wall beside the door. My clothes. My toiletries. A few framed photographs, wrapped carefully in towels. Tyler had at least been careful with the photographs, which I notice now, in retrospect, with a complicated kind of grief. And taped to the door was the note. "Mom, this is for the best. You'll thank me later. The house is legally mine now. You signed it over last year, remember? Crystal and I need our own space to build our life. I left you some money in an envelope to help with a hotel for a few nights. I love you. Tyler." The envelope contained $300. I sat down on my own front steps, in my church dress, with a casserole dish in my lap, and I called my daughter. Michelle arrived within 20 minutes. I will not describe in detail what Michelle said when she read that note, except that I had never, in 34 years of knowing my daughter, heard her use language like that. She wanted to call the police immediately. I told her to wait. I was, even in that moment of profound disorientation, still trying to protect Tyler from consequences. That instinct, I would later understand, was exactly the instinct that had allowed this to happen in the first place. Michelle took me to her house that night. The next morning, she insisted, not asked, insisted, that we see an attorney. The attorney's name was Harold Whitman, an elder law specialist with 30 years of experience in Tulsa. I sat in his office and told him everything: the conversation about helping with bills, the title company visit, the year I had continued living in the house without incident, and finally, the locks and the trash bags and the note. Mr. Whitman asked to see the deed. When his paralegal pulled it up, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I will remember for the rest of my life. He said, "Mrs. Ashford, what your son did to you has a name. It's called elder financial exploitation, and depending on the specific circumstances of how this deed was obtained, it may also constitute fraud." He explained that the quitclaim deed itself was likely valid as executed. I had, after all, signed it voluntarily, even if I had not fully understood its terms. But he explained that Oklahoma law, like the law in most states, takes a serious view of transactions involving vulnerable adults where there is evidence of undue influence, misrepresentation, or a fiduciary relationship that was exploited rather than honored. He also explained something I had not known, that my life estate, the right I had retained to live in the house until my death, meant that Tyler legally could not remove me from the property without a formal eviction process, regardless of who held the underlying ownership. What Tyler had done, changing the locks, removing my belongings, leaving a note instead of pursuing any legal process, was not a legitimate exercise of his ownership rights. It was, in plain terms, an illegal lockout. Mr. Whitman filed for an emergency restoration of my access to the property within 4 days. He also began building a civil case to challenge the validity of the deed transfer itself, based on the circumstances under which it had been obtained, my documented grief and vulnerability at the time, the brief and inadequately explained signing process, and the absence of independent legal counsel representing my interests during the transaction. Tyler was served with the emergency filing on a Thursday. Through his own attorney, he attempted to argue that I had voluntarily transferred the property, and that the locks had been changed for security reasons unrelated to the deed. The judge who heard the emergency motion did not find this argument persuasive, particularly once Mr. Whitman presented the note Tyler had left taped to the door, which the judge described, in open court, as remarkably candid evidence of intent. I was restored to legal access of my home within 9 days of being locked out. Tyler and Crystal were required to vacate during the pendency of the civil action. The civil case took 5 months. Mr. Whitman built a careful argument that the deed transfer had been obtained through a combination of undue influence, given Tyler's position as my primary support system following years of grief and isolation, and inadequate disclosure, since Tyler had misrepresented the legal effect of the document I signed. We also had Michelle's testimony about the family dynamics, financial records showing Tyler's history of dependency, and the testimony of the title company employee who, under deposition, admitted that the closing had been unusually brief and that standard explanations of the deed's legal effect had not been thoroughly walked through. The judge ruled in my favor in July. The quitclaim deed was rescinded on grounds of undue influence and material misrepresentation. Full ownership of the house was restored to me, retroactively, as though the original transfer had never occurred. I want to tell you about the 6 months in between, because that is where the real story lives, not in the courtroom, but in the long, quiet, complicated process of a mother understanding what her son had actually done to her. I did not speak to Tyler during most of that period. Michelle handled what little communication was necessary. I spent those months in Michelle's guest bedroom and later, once the emergency order restored my access, back in my own home alone for the first time since Carl's death, truly alone, without Tyler's presence either helping or harming. I will tell you something I am not proud of, but that I think is honest. Those months alone in my house were, in some ways, the most peaceful months I had experienced since Carl died. I rediscovered routines that were entirely mine. I rearranged the living room. I started attending a grief support group I had avoided for years because Tyler had always needed me to be available in the evenings. I started, slowly, to remember who I was when I was not managing someone else's crisis. Tyler called for the first time in late June, a few weeks before the final ruling. I almost didn't answer. I am glad I did. He was crying before I said anything. He told me Crystal had left him in April, shortly after the eviction. Once it became clear the legal situation was not resolving in his favor and the relationship had cost him more than he had calculated. He told me he had been staying with a friend, that he had lost yet another job. That he understood, finally, he said. He understood what he had done. I let him talk for a long time without interrupting. When he finished, I said, "Tyler, I love you. I have loved you since the day you were born, and I will love you until the day I die. But I need you to understand that what you did to me was not a mistake born of confusion. You knew what that deed meant. You knew what those locks meant. You knew what that note meant when you taped it to my door." He didn't argue. He just kept crying. I told him that I forgave him, and I meant that, because I have learned that forgiveness is something I do for my own peace, not something I owe as a reward for someone else's remorse. But I also told him that forgiveness did not mean restoration of trust, and that trust, unlike forgiveness, has to be rebuilt slowly, through demonstrated change over time, not through tears in a single phone call. We have spoken several times since the ruling. Tyler is in counseling now, his choice, and I am glad of it. He has a job again, modest, but stable. He does not live with me, and I have told him clearly that he will not live with me again, not because I have stopped loving him, but because I have learned, at considerable cost, what happens when love is not accompanied by boundaries. I think about that note often. Mom, this is for the best. You'll thank me later. I have turned those words over in my mind more times than I can count. I do not thank him. But I have, in an unexpected way, thanked the experience itself, because it taught me something about myself that 26 years in that house and 8 years of grief had not fully revealed. It taught me that I am not only Carl's widow, and not only Tyler and Michelle's mother. I am also Deborah. A woman capable of standing in a courtroom and reclaiming what was legally and rightfully hers. A woman capable of loving her son completely while still telling him no. I am 59 years old. I live in my own house, on my own terms, with the deed in my name and the locks changed back to ones I control. Carl's photograph still sits on the mantel. My grief group meets on Wednesdays. Michelle and her children come for dinner most Sundays after church. And Tyler comes too, sometimes. Not as the man who once held the keys to my house. As my son. Slowly earning his way back to being trusted with anything at all. If Deborah's story moved you, if you have ever loved someone so completely that you missed the warning signs, or been betrayed by someone who should have protected you instead, share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you have a story of reclaiming what was rightfully yours, we want to hear it. Send it to us. We read every single one. Real stories. Real strength. Real justice.